All right. Greetings, George and Shingai. Um, it's May 11th, and we're in education. You can always also look over to knowledge engineering, which has been pretty active with the follow-up from the language model work. Other than that, I think that looking at your newsletter, Shingai, hearing your experiences on that, and anything else that either of you want to do, let's just do it, and then we'll be done when we're done. So how has it been with the newsletter?
Oh, yeah, it has been good overall. I've gotten some nice feedback, especially on the earlier pieces. I had John Chalonnet reach out to me and give me some advice, and he also reposted my work on his newsletter. So I feel like it's definitely a good learning experience. I'm sort of getting a sense for what works, what doesn't work. I do feel like this most recent piece, maybe it was a bit too long. I don't know, but I noticed it was like the one that got like the least attention. And yeah, I would just say I'm just appreciating the structure I'm imposing on myself to just commit to doing one piece per week. It's helping with my own learning experience. I'm getting like a slow and steady stream of new people subscribing, and yeah, I'm glad I'm doing it. It's kind of like a high level take.
Great, great.
Awesome.
Yeah.
This may or may not have been me. I wouldn't know.
uh,
Is anything not a system, George?
Pardon me?
Is there anything that is not a system?
I struggle with that one. Space and time are not systems, I don't think. Um, but there's anywhere that you get interactions and dynamics, you're looking at something that's systemic. And if you look at matter and energy, I mean, I don't know how you would describe it as well, first of all, first rule is there's no such thing as a truly isolated slash closed system within the confines of the universe as a whole. I mean, you can approximate it, but even there, you're dealing with microstates are that have dynamics involved. So I just can't think of something that I would definitely exclude as being a system. I know a lot of people think of things like piles of sand as being or rocks or things like that. But if you take a microscope to any of those things, you find that they're real and have a long enough time window. You find that there are things going on, and as long as that's and going on according to rules, according to even if it's stochastic. In the case of a sand pile, you both are familiar with what's it called? Criticality.
Self-organized criticality.
Self-organized criticality. So I mean, it's conceivable to see these things as systems. Again, you have to look at what are the boundaries, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and so on. So a long way of saying I can't say for certain that there are any non-systems within the framework of the universe as a whole.
And that's what Buckminster Fuller's system concept was. Universe is the total actual totality, and every subset of universe, however you chose it or assembled it, is system. Any but then that's very interesting about like, is a sort of abstract concept a system in itself? Is patience a system, or dignity or something? It's just a
Well, I
term.
think you have to then look at what's going on in the brain that supports these various characteristics or personality traits or a whole variety of things. And as long as you're looking at the process that's taking place in the brain, you are looking at a system or a subsystem. And
Yeah.
even abstract mathematics, if you take a formula, as long as you're reading an equation, that might be in a book, as long as that's going into your brain and you're sorting out what the pieces are and how they interact with one another in order to try to understand that equation, that's a system. It's just that it's not a system on paper, it's a system while it's active in the brain.
Hmm. Yeah. So would you say that in the case of something like patience or dignity, it's the neurons and the connections between the neurons and sort of like that state, which is the system, or could be considered the system?
Yeah, and I would, specify every subsystem is a system, right? So if we take that holonic view, the circuitry that's responsible for instantiating patience, whatever that is, and some inhibitory thing that keeps you from reacting immediately or self-control kind of thing. That circuitry is itself a subsystem of a larger circuit of consciousness, and therefore constitutes a system in its own right. And you can look for the boundary. What neurons are actually participating in that process, and what are the inputs? What are the outputs? Like the inhibitory outputs to the limbic system, otherwise cause you to lose your patience, so to speak. So I think you can basically take any kind of conceptual construct that is true of human or animal or any psychology, and I hate to use the term, but reduce it to the circuitry that is sort of most active during that process, and treat that as a system.
Yeah, this seems to have also a lot to do with embodiment, because what I hear you saying is like the concept in its abstraction. I mean, you said the boundary of the system of interest. You referred to something that was material, like patience as embodied in a specific instance. Somebody could argue that that was shifting the regime of attention to something that was not asked about, when it was the actual question was, is the concept a system, not does a system with that property have other properties of systemness? Surely it does.
You can't have a concept unless there's some active process going on in the brain. I mean, concepts are not. I don't take the what am I trying to say? Not Aristotle. What am I trying to say?
Oh, idealist.
Yeah, I don't take the idealist approach that there are these things that are out there a priori in their perfect form, and that we simply go through a process of discovering their shadows. It's for me, it's an evolutionary question that these are embodied in our brain circuitry because these were found to be, the capacity to think of these concepts was found to be very beneficial to our evolution. So anyway, that's a stance. I can't really I can't find sufficient support for arguments about idealism that don't involve, well, I can't find any.
It's definitely a belief-based position. That, yeah. Okay. Any other thoughts, or what are your next moves in the newsletters?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of ideas. I'm thinking about introducing some polls into some of my posts in order to like get some more interactivity with the readers. So asking for like opinions about certain topics, certain issues, and just like inserting polls into the newsletters. I actually so I missed the large language model presentation you gave a few weeks ago live, but I did watch it a few days ago, and it inspired some like pretty strong feelings in me. And so I kind of want to write about system science and artificial intelligence. So I'm really curious, Daniel, what was your experience? George, I don't know if you watched it. What was your experience? But yeah, I could like really resonate with and understand some of the cynicism, but I also appreciated some of the optimism and hope. And it kind of led me down this rabbit hole of just like looking on Twitter and like following up on the latest developments of AI. And yeah, kind of, I don't know. I feel like I've had my head in the sand about AI, and this talk inspired me to sort of lift my head up a little bit. So, Daniel and George, what was your experience like with that session? And I will use that to sort of like feed my writing, because I feel I have an intuition that system science can play an important role in helping us grapple with this technology, but that is just an intuition, and I have a lot of research to do before I can make any like claims.
Yeah, George, go for it first.
Well, AI is something of a misnomer to begin with. I mean, there's not a singular general agreement on what the nature of intelligence is. We got all kinds of attributes that people have talked about, and there's a number of models of what constitutes intelligence in terms of problem solving capacity, rationality, multiple intelligences that have to do with different modes of human behavior and so on and so forth. So there's a problem right there with the terminology. If we restrict our understanding of what we're talking about to pattern recognition and pattern learning and pattern recognition, pattern extraction from data and things of that nature, and that what we're doing in effect is trying to what these large language models are doing is trying to I don't know what's the word, construct new patterns based on old patterns, but they're not, those machines are not introducing what you would really call creativity or any of these other the other things that go into what makes human beings in general behave in what we would call an intelligent manner. So there's that aspect of it. I was just telling Daniel as you were signing in about my dissertation, which was nominally in the area of AI, nominally in the area of artificial neural networks, but I was taking a different path than the guys. I was actually living in San Diego at the time. I actually knew David Rummelhart and David Zipser and met what's his name, Geoff Hinton. He was there several times. They formed a group. They called it the PDP group, the Parallel Distributed Processing Group. And I went to a number of their meetings, their seminars and whatnot. But I was taking a different path in what I was pursuing, as opposed to this model that they used using backpropagation learning. Because I thought that was a very, very limited view. It was, wonderful as an engineering solution to problems of identifying patterns and classification, basically being able to classify patterns within a single category. But that's all it was. And not much has changed. It's what I think has happened recently with these LLMs is that they've produced some startling output that's got everybody a Twitter now about, oh my God, are they becoming conscious? Are they really doing this? Have we created a monster and so forth? You can imagine that if, by analogy, a hammer was designed to strike and pound nails into wood, right? Or to shatter things that you might want shattered, sledgehammer. It was not designed to crack open a human head. But if somebody takes it and cracks open a human head, which is perfectly possible to do, that's cause for alarm. But the cause for alarm isn't that the hammer did something. The cause for alarm is that a human being took that hammer and did something it was not intended to be for. That's where I think the real danger is. Now, getting back to the ISSS and what Daniel is, I think, pursuing, is the use of a large language model approach in handling finding all of the documentation and so forth that's relevant to the ISSS and to system science, and trying to get it organized in a way that makes it available to people in general, which I think is an appropriate use of the tool. So I'm not too terribly concerned that we're going to unleash something terrible in the world. But AI and system science, very definite. I mean, system science is at the base of all the other sciences. It's meta science. So if we consider AI another kind of science, then clearly we have to look at it from a systems perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really helpful. That differentiation between sort of what Daniel is proposing in terms of using this approach to accomplish a specific task, and that will be helpful, versus I think what my perception was that a lot of people got distracted by all this like chatter around, oh, like, what are we creating? What are the societal implications of like widespread adoption? There seemed to be less focus on using it as a tool and more of a focus on like, what does this mean for humanity? Yeah, Daniel, any thoughts?
Yeah. All right. Well, first, just on one technical note, in the last several years, it's been understood that predictive coding architectures, which are biologically plausible, are able to arbitrarily approximate backpropagation. So I think that, ironically, we're going to backpropagate understandings through time backwards that help us understand the systemness of different so-called artificial intelligence. I also agree that that is like the worst possible capitulation or recapitulation of like a natural artificial divide. It's an extended intelligence or augmented intelligence. Or I've also thought about like artificial doesn't mean like fake and phony. Artificial could mean craft and artisanal. Like artifice is something that's constructed. So I don't think it needs to have that connotation of being separate from natural intelligence, but just the fact of the matter is, for many English speakers, it has that connotation, but it shouldn't matter how the English terminology is in the minds of people. It should be more about what it is. As for the presentation, it was definitely fun, and in the follow-up knowledge engineering meetings, there's been also some wild times. I mean, protecting the innocent and just sort of generalizing into archetypes that I saw, like the two archetypes that are valid, but I don't believe were the most helpful. Just not any person, just in general. One of them is like speculation about the future, like broad global. What if another group uses another tool to do another thing? It's like, well, now we're talking about everything. So unfettered terror and anxiety and speculation, I just didn't see as within our system of interest or within our concern. So from a systems engineering perspective, it was a non sequitur. And the other, again, valid but not essentially helpful to our actual work, which we can do. It's not just a conversation group. We want to do things, is like the sort of just generalized speculation about consciousness, intelligence, and just grinding gears that many people have been grinding their entire lives about just language, intelligence, agency, like general comments about the technology, sometimes even failing to integrate with what I was showing on the screen. For example, when it translated, when it was able to summarize notes at 3 levels of sophistication and translate it into English and Spanish, and then someone said it's garbage in, garbage out, I was like, I don't know. You decide. The corpus was made by humans, and this output is clearly doing something valid. So I just, how could you make an in principle, machine learning models, they don't do it like I do it. So then it was so like that was kind of absurd. Another one was like people, and not just in that one session, just in general, saying, well, the information is not factually correct, and it's just like, well, I think there's a lot too much focus on what one given model can do, and most people who don't have a software engineering background don't understand how powerful it already is in combination with software flows like Perplexity AI. So every single time you still hear people saying, well, they're not connected to the internet, they don't get good information. First off, as if doing internet searches gave you good information. But second off, it's a done deal and it's free. So there's like a lot of focus on like a narrow understanding and kind of making like a straw person of a narrow understanding, and a non-reckoning with what the actuality of what we already have is. That I know that sounds kind of like negative or critical, but the third archetype, which I believe is the dominant one that will retain participation in our work, is like, we can actually use this. Like, we don't have to watch the train go by and speculate and philosophize. We can be using tools just like systems engineers and system scientists. And so in that regard, it's the more things change, the more they stay the same. We already have machine learning in high reliability settings, like neural networks that are being used for cancer diagnostic, let's say. So this is just a different statistical model with a different input output, a different modeling life cycle. So this is where systems comes into play, is like we actually can think about the generalizations, not just us wanting to apply it to ISSS's corpus and associated works for synthesis, but like, I believe that in this science or meta science, as George just put it, we have the conceptual and the technical frameworks to reckon and design with these ecosystems of cognitive entities. So overall, it was a fun session, and like, I hope it kind of moved some people out of their local optima, like from the in principle stances that they had held 3 months ago or 1 year ago or 15 years ago. Because a lot of those stances are either just incorrect or irrelevant in light of what we can really already do. And that's something that I'm still learning and thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I know I'm both deeply curious and excited about how we can use these LLMs in a practical sense to accomplish goals. And I kind of share some of this existential dread about what other people are going to do with the LLMs. George, I have a question that's like slightly on a different topic, but I'm curious, in your work on like robotics and AI, were you still operating under the like connectionist paradigm, just taking a different approach? And like where there's this debate between like connectionists and symbolists. So was your work connectionist, just taking a different approach, or something different?
No, it was connectionist in that general overall approach. It was definitely not what they call distributed representation. So the back propagation approach to things is you have, this multi-layered set of neurons that are fully connected, generally fully connected. They can be connected in slightly different ways. You can trim connections, but there are a variety of different things that you can play around with. But fundamentally, the whole concept is based on the notion that a representation of a pattern is distributed among all of the synaptic connections throughout the layers of the network, as opposed to the approach I was taking, which was my interpretation of what goes on in the brain. Not that there are grandmother cells, but there are clusters of cells that definitely are identified with specific representations. So, for example, I don't know, Ching, have you heard of face neurons?
Face. Phase or face?
Face, like my,
Face.
recognition of faces.
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Okay, so these are it's still, somewhat it's not so much controversial, but I don't think we've pinned down exactly what's going on. But people have found neurons that get excited when a specific face comes into view. The famous one being Jennifer Aniston. People were, had some set of neurons that went wild when Jennifer Aniston was, but nowhere else. But in monkeys, they have discovered that there's a hierarchy of neural circuits that become progressively excited, starting with a generalized notion of a face, a very, two eyes, a nose, and a mouth. Like even a happy face will set these neurons off. And they get more specific. So there's a hierarchy of representations, but they are very localized to specific neural circuits. So this is completely different from the distributed representation that you find in the in this artificial ANNs, artificial neural networks, and what's being used in primarily in the deep learning networks that they've built and so forth.
Okay. And they're taking this approach because they found that it has been effective. So what they're doing works. And so they see no need to try and mimic the human brain more realistically.
Yeah, that I mentioned the my time in San Diego and going to these conferences, I actually sat right next to um, Francis Crick, who was in La Jolla at the time, and uh, some of these other big name people in these conferences, and they were just continuing to say, "Oh, this is just like what the brain does. It generalizes, it can deal with certain amount of degradation. If you take a neuron out or clip a synapse or something like that, it still is able to function reasonably well." And they had a whole list of things why this is just like what goes on in the brain. And that's David Zipser is infamous for having said, "Oh, when we really understand what's going on in neural circuits in the brain, we're going to find its back propagation." And they stuck to that until neurobiologists started finding out what actually is going on in the interconnections between neurons and modular circuitry and all these other features, which sort of give lie to the notion that you have this distributed representation. So you don't hear that too much anymore, or at least I haven't recently.
Okay, that's helpful.
And that's actually why I believe that this asymptotic approximation between hierarchical predictive coding architectures and backpropagation as just kind of a computational heuristic, like it allows us to reinterpret what we've seen as a computer science approximation to architectures that are biologically plausible in different ways, in the sense that they do only require local computation.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's where I started. I started from that. So I can replicate pattern recognition in a set of neural circuits based on local coding. So anyway, yeah, that's
Yeah.
Yeah, this is
I mean, I always just think, what would happen if system science was a starting point? If it wasn't a fight to systemness,
yeah.
but if
Yeah.
we started, and that's not just the same as like this starting with a global or zoomed out, but just starting with the properties, and then instead of trying to like build up to the properties, it's like we kind of know what they're gonna be, or the spaces that they can be, or like the flavors that they can be, and we can still stay open-minded for like for bottom-up surprisal and recategorization, reclassification into new properties and so on. But I mean, we have an entry point that can shift the process, and I think in this post, I mean, here's my thought when I saw the method and this one. I'm sure that you've made simpler and different representations, but I mean, put these two side by side. Put the first grade, this is what scientists and lab coats do, with like the reality of like what is happening, even if people don't understand that is what's happening. People are gonna say, I want this one. Even though it's like, actually, the people who say they're doing this one are doing this one.
Yeah.
And so it's like, this one doesn't exist. Wow. It was just a representation that even in its implementation was always this way.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess my last thought on this topic is, yeah, I would love to be writing more about the intersection between system science and AI, and really focusing on, yeah, sort of like one approach will be looking at the work that ISSS is doing. So I would love to be more involved with knowledge engineering stuff and getting a sense of how you and the others are thinking about how to use this within ISSS and then writing about it. And then separately sort of writing about some of the bigger picture philosophical, how can system science as a framework help society develop a healthier relationship with these LLMs. So would love to do writing on both of those topics and talking about both of you with it. Yeah.
Oh, it would be awesome. I see those as like the sort of the double helix of this initiative, which is like, let's focus on the ISSS corpus and the associated corpus and highlight accessibility and rigor and applicability, just like we're always trying to do. But in the way that we're doing that and thinking about that process, let us also have new understandings about how to work as the knowledge work, I mean, exits the search phase in most situations outside of specific archival or forensic type analyses. I mean, Google is going to put a generative result above the search results. And in general, everything that we've ever thought of as a search bar is going to be an opportunity for, like, you're going to search for a video on, how to do this. Like, searching always was a prompt, but now instead of a database lookup, it's going to do this semantic space mapping. And that's going to be changing what we're doing. So, I mean, we should totally play with all of these things and set up these flows. Yeah, I won't mention any more about any specific things that came up in the meeting, but it just makes me think of, like, we have the flow, and it's like, I don't know. It's like there's like if it were like a dam and a civil engineering problem, and some people were speculating about what would happen if another thing happened, and somebody else was speculating about and then, like, the third path, we get to avert catastrophe and philosophize, but we actually move forward by using and understanding. So I think that may happen in the knowledge engineering, but it's definitely it's the overlap with education. I mean, even with your posts, let's put your posts into these tables and summarize it into a tweet thread or something, and just make it very easy for you to share it at different lengths. But we can just treat it as a generative experiment that augments what we want to do, and just show that there's a way where we can judiciously apply techniques and transparently. Let's cross post into different languages and prepare outreach invitations for colleagues with different language backgrounds, or run a parallel experiment with a high school level or with middle school level or something like that. Since you still get to, like, call like you see it, write it like you want it in the actual, but then we can augment that and do more.
Yeah, absolutely. One other thing, I think it was Peter who made a comment during the session where he asked, like how does ISSS, like, how do we build our own AI system? And it made me wonder, would it be possible to build some sort of AI that sort of combined the expert systems approach with the LLM approach? So you could have an AI that had ideas of systemness embedded in it at the core, and then was, like, augmented with machine learning. Like, could that be done? Because that would be cool.
Oh,
Well,
yes.
Oh,
yeah, I would say so. The motivation, the third part of the new book, System Science, is about the complex, adaptive, and evolvable system archetype.
mm-hmm.
And my overarching concept here is that our brains actually have that archetype embedded in them, because that is what we can do to look out at the world, see something, and then begin to map it, what we're seeing, what we're observing, perceiving. Actually, this acts as an organizing element for taking the perceptual input and starting to structure it. And it fits in um, with the active inference notion, in that we start with sort of a hard coded or what's the word for it, well, it's a built-in
Prior,
uh
inherited prior.
well, it constitutes a prior in the Bayesian sense, you mean?
Yeah.
But the um, yeah, it's the starting point for generating expectations for what's going to be observed, and then take the error, the observation error as it occurs, and start to modify. But the brain has to have the ability to have this core model to start with, and then begin to particularize it based on actual um, observational experience. Um, and so, whether it's a large language model or some generalized AI that is capable of essentially doing that, looking at the world and saying, oh, this is a system. Now, how do I start to identify what are the inputs, what are the outputs, what are the boundaries, what are the internals that are producing these dynamics, and so on and so forth. So that's um, and that's the basis. I mean, my idea was, okay, if you start with that model, that archetype, then you've got something. If you go into an engineering of a complex system, you know exactly what kinds of things that system are going to have generically. And then you go into the actual engineering is a process of identifying the particulars, and then making sure that those are in the proper relation to one another.
I'll just give a few other short notes about how that can come into play. First off, again, it's not about making one monolithic model to rule them all. You can easily generate flows so that you can have expert systems, formal knowledge models, etc. And with the schema that they use for input and output, use a variety of language models and transformers to enrich them. So you could have it, for example, do parameter sweeps across an expert system to and then with the outputs distill or tally. So it's in the composition of the models that there's so much power. Some people are approaching this from like the neurosymbolic programming angle, looking at systems that do have formal semantics arising from subsemantic interactions. And I expect there to be better tools, which I know are already being worked on, but just not widely used or available, that include, for example, when a question is asked, dispatches could perform knowledge searches, expert systems, specification of simulations and evaluations, and then those could also be synthesized back together. So we're already past the point where those systems compositionality is possible. And truly the question is which expert system and why, and what inputs and what outputs and how. But in principle, I think if you can imagine the data transformation, it's a pure engineering question.
Okay. Okay. Amazing. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Daniel, for giving that presentation. It definitely convinced me that the way that that sticking my head in the sand is like not the right way to relate to this stuff, and that it is important to like engage with it and sort of like build the world I want to see rather than like cower in fear and be like, oh, like what's happening? This is scary. So I'm excited to like learn more about this, start applying these things. And George, my friend that I mentioned to you, Michael, who has been reading your textbook,
All right.
he's up here in San Francisco, close to me. Feel like he could be a good potential future member for the ISSS. And so I'll have someone to like work with who has a background in computer engineering and bioengineering, so I can get some like hands-on experience with what it looks like to program these things. So I'm excited.
Yeah, I have yet to send him an email. I saw you
Okay.
sent me his email address, so I'll try to get at that. I hope it's kind of helpful. The chapter numbering system is offset by one because of the Springer took the introduction to the book and made it chapter one. So
I'm sure it'll be fine. Yeah.
okay,
The classic 0 or 1 indexing issue.
yeah.
All right, awesome. Thank you, fellows. Till next time.
Well,
Great.
let me just add one very quick, and we'll take it up at some future time. But I've been giving an awful lot of more thought to the education process itself and what's going to work best. And I've given up pretty much completely on the standard educational system that we have to work with now. And so at some point in the future, I do want to explore further this idea of developing an institute that is not, sanctioned by the ordinary educational process, but has sufficient funding to be able to produce educational programs that actually are based on system science itself.
Yeah.
So hopefully we'll continue that conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to explore that. And I read a paper a few weeks ago, which did a deep dive into the history of the Santa Fe Institute and some of the like internal politics and how they did things. So I feel like there's a lot to learn from that experience, both good and bad. So
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Nice. Well, with the Active Inference Institute, I have some views into that in a modern setting. Also, different and good and bad and all that. So I agree. And of course, no disrespect to anyone or any entity, but that's not necessarily ISSS's role in a systems ecosystem. So I can see why you see that another vehicle could really help with education. All right. Thank you, fellows. See you.
Yep. Bye.
Take care.